Imagine a product so powerful it can generate endless profit without ever creating something you can touch. A product so unseen that most people buy it every single day without realizing it. That product is debt. And debt is far from a neutral tool of finance. It has been intentionally shaped into the most lucrative invention in human history. It has bankrolled wars, toppled empires, enslaved nations, and quietly drained the wealth of ordinary citizens. Yet if you ask most people where debt began, who engineered it, or why it dominates our entire financial system, they'd have no answer. The history of debt isn't just a story about economics, it's the story of money, power, and control itself. At its core, debt is nothing more than a promise. You take something today and agree to return it tomorrow. But hidden inside that promise lies the true source of financial control: interest. By charging interest, the future itself is turned into a source of profit. For thousands of years, civilizations wrestled with this concept. In ancient Mesopotamia, debts were carved into clay tablets, but rulers also declared debt jubilees, wiping the slate clean when too many people became trapped in obligations. Even the Hebrew Bible commanded that every 50 years debts be forgiven. The message was clear: unchecked debt could destroy societies, turning free citizens into slaves of obligation. As history moved forward, the powerful discovered something crucial. Debt didn't need to be forgiven, it could be weaponized. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church outlawed usury, the act of charging excessive interest. But merchants and bankers were clever. They hid loans inside trade deals or crafted elaborate credit arrangements that didn't look like loans at all. By the time of the Renaissance, families like the Medici in Florence had mastered this art. They built vast empires, not through land or armies, but through the business of lending. They financed kings, popes, and merchants alike, and what they gained in return was more than wealth. It was influence, the power to shape politics itself. Debt had evolved into more than a financial tool, it had become a weapon of control. The true revolution in debt began in the 17th century with the emergence of national borrowing. During its struggle for independence from Spain, the Dutch Republic turned to its own citizens for funding, selling government bonds that paid interest and could be traded like property. This changed everything. Wars were no longer bound by the gold or silver in a ruler's vault. They could now be financed endlessly by mortgaging the future. The Dutch refined this system, and soon England followed their lead. In 1694, the creation of the Bank of England made national debt a permanent feature of governance. Instead of appealing to individual lenders, the state borrowed from a central institution that issued notes backed by those loans. For the first time, a government didn't just use debt in times of crisis, it depended on it, renewing it again and again. The bankers who controlled this machinery became vital to the monarchy itself. Debt had evolved from a private arrangement into the cornerstone of state power. The rewards were staggering. Lending to governments became the safest and most profitable venture imaginable because states could always tax their citizens to repay their creditors. Wars that once drained royal treasuries could now continue indefinitely, fueled by borrowed money. And those same wars expanded empires, unlocked new trade routes, and created even greater demand for credit. It was a flawless feedback loop. The more nations fought, the deeper they sank into debt, and the wealthier their financiers became. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the bond markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam pulsed as the financial centers of the world. Armies advanced, fleets set sail, and continents were conquered, all financed by promises to pay later. But debt didn't stop at the borders of empires. It moved into everyday life. As industrial capitalism spread, ordinary people became part of the same financial web. Railroads, factories, and vast infrastructure networks were all built on credit, financed through loans and bonds. The workers who powered this new economy earned wages from companies funded by borrowed money, and soon they too began borrowing. They took on loans to buy homes, tools, and eventually consumer goods. Debt wasn't just a tool of kings and nations anymore. It had quietly woven itself into the daily lives of millions, becoming the lifeblood of modern economic growth. By the 20th century, debt had fully transformed into a mass-market product. It was no longer reserved for nations or industrial magnates. It became the everyday companion of ordinary life. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards, student financing, every pillar of modern living was built to make borrowing feel normal, even necessary. And here lies the brilliance, or perhaps the cruelty behind it. Debt doesn't just earn profit once. Each interest payment transfers wealth from the borrower to the lender, from millions of individuals to a small circle of creditors, endlessly repeating. Unlike something you buy and own, debt is engineered to last, to keep you paying long after the original purchase. A home financed over 30 years ends up costing several times its listed price. A credit card balance left unpaid can snowball faster than your income can catch it. What begins as a promise of opportunity often becomes a lifelong obligation, a quiet, invisible trap. Debt is more than a financial tool. It is the most profitable enterprise ever devised. It needs no factories, no products, and no raw materials. Its raw material is time itself. Those who first grasped this, the merchants of Amsterdam, the bankers of London, the financiers of Wall Street, built entire empires on that insight. They didn't just profit from debt, they institutionalized it. The modern financial system they created doesn't merely manage borrowing, it produces it, multiplies it, and relies on it for survival. Debt became not just a product of the system, but the system itself.
By the mid-20th century, debt was no longer a last resort for nations. It had become the heartbeat of the global economy. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, often praised as a triumph of international unity, cemented this new reality. Out of it came the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions created to lend money to countries in distress or in need of development. But behind the idealistic language was a far more calculated design: debt as a tool of control. Nations could borrow, but only under the rules set by their creditors. The IMF, largely influenced by the United States and Europe, began attaching structural adjustment requirements to its loans. Entire economies were told what to cut, what to sell, and how to restructure. Debt became more than a source of funding, it was a political instrument. Countries that borrowed heavily often discovered their independence shrinking, their budgets rewritten not by their own leaders, but in offices thousands of miles away in Washington or Basel. The world was told it was about stability and growth, but in practice, it bred dependency. Meanwhile, another transformation was quietly unfolding in the lives of ordinary people. In the years following World War II, banks realized they could market debt directly to consumers rather than just to nations or corporations. The home mortgage became the ultimate symbol of middle-class success. Owning a house, once the privilege of the wealthy, was now possible for millions, though it came with decades of repayments. Soon, loans for cars, furniture, and later, credit cards, turned personal debt into a mainstream consumer product. Borrowing was no longer seen as risky or shameful, it was celebrated as progress. Advertising promised comfort, freedom, and convenience, all on credit. Buy now, pay later became the defining motto of a new era. That was no longer just an economic tool, it had become a lifestyle, shaping how people worked, dreamed, and defined prosperity itself. For the banking industry, this new age of borrowing was a financial gold rush. Interest payments from millions of households created a constant compounding stream of income. Governments benefited too. Credit-fueled spending made the economy appear to grow endlessly, even as real wages stopped keeping pace. Corporations, meanwhile, enjoyed a market of consumers always ready to spend money they didn't yet earn. Debt had quietly become the invisible engine of modern capitalism. And unlike manufacturing goods, issuing credit had no limits. There were no factories to build, no resources to extract, just contracts to sign, interest to collect, and the remarkable power to create money from promises alone. But with limitless profit came a dangerous dependency. The entire financial system grew hooked on perpetual growth. Banks no longer wanted loans paid off quickly, they preferred borrowers who stayed in debt, refinancing and extending their payments for decades. The longer the debt, the greater the profit. Governments fell into the same habit, realizing that borrowing was far easier and far more popular than raising taxes. Politicians could deliver prosperity now and leave the bill for future generations. Central banks kept the machine alive, creating new money and ensuring credit always flowed. What had once been a temporary financial tool had evolved into the foundation of the global economy, a system built not on balance, but on endless expansion. By the 1970s and 80s, the cost of the world's debt addiction could no longer be ignored. Developing nations across Latin America, Africa and Asia had borrowed heavily during the boom years, encouraged by Western banks eager to reinvest the flood of petrodollars from the oil shocks. But when U.S. interest rates skyrocketed under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, those SAM countries suddenly faced an impossible burden. In 1982, Mexico became the first to declare it couldn't pay, and the global debt crisis began. The prescribed cure was more borrowing, this time under stricter conditions enforced by the IMF and World Bank. Debt turned from a lifeline into a cage. Nations borrowed to stay afloat, then borrowed again just to make payments, losing more control with every round. Ordinary people bore the cost through austerity, unemployment, and inflation, while the elites and foreign creditors continued to profit from their suffering. At the same time, the rich nations of the world were transforming debt into something new. Banks and financiers discovered they could take ordinary loans, mortgages, car payments, corporate bonds, and bundle them into complex securities to sell on global markets. Debt itself became a product to trade. The relationship between borrower and lender dissolved. Now credit was sliced, packaged, and sold like any other commodity. Wall Street shifted its focus away from producing goods and toward engineering financial instruments built on layers of debt. This process, known as financialization, made credit the most valuable raw material of the modern economy. The profits were enormous. Banks could issue a loan, sell it to investors, and move on to the next one, collecting fees all along the way. The risks, they claimed, were dispersed. In reality, they were simply buried, waiting for the next collapse to expose them. The financial crash of 2008 wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable consequence of decades of excess. Trillions of dollars in mortgage-backed securities, built on the illusion that American homeowners would never default at the same time, suddenly unraveled. Debt had been stretched far beyond what reality could sustain, and when it broke, the entire global economy shook. Governments rushed to intervene, not to hold the culprits accountable, but to save them. The very institutions that had created the disaster were deemed too big to fail. Families lost homes, jobs, and life savings, while the banks that caused the collapse were rescued with taxpayer money. And in the aftermath, rather than learning restraint, the system doubled down. Instead of shrinking, debt grew larger than ever. The crisis that was born from too much debt was the justification for creating even more. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero and flooded markets with liquidity, ensuring that borrowing would never stop. Debt had now crossed a threshold. It was no longer just profitable, it was essential. Every layer of the global economy relied on it. Governments used it to cover deficits, corporations borrowed to buy back their own stocks, and households relied on credit to maintain their way of life. Without continuous borrowing, the entire structure would crumble. Debt had evolved into the ultimate product, one that could be endlessly renewed, endlessly expanded, and endlessly sold. It required no factory, no materials, only trust from borrowers and the guarantee that governments would always keep the system alive.
After the 2008 crash, central banks unleashed a historic experiment. Interest rates were slashed to zero, and an ocean of newly created money was poured into the global financial system, all in the name of stability. But instead of curing the disease, this medicine made the addiction worse. Cheap money became the fuel for an even greater borrowing frenzy. Governments, corporations, and ordinary people all dove deeper into debt, convinced that credit was endless and risk-free. The result? A world drowning in obligations. Global debt has now soared past $300 trillion, more than 3 times the total value of everything humanity produces in a year. Never before has so much been owed by so many to so few. And yet, this mountain of debt is paraded as success. Politicians boast about rising GDP figures, even though much of that growth is simply borrowed from the future. Debt has become so embedded in modern life that few ever stop to question it. A young person takes on crushing student loans and calls it an investment. A family signs a mortgage that will take decades to repay and celebrates it as a dream achieved. Governments run endless deficits and the public shrugs. The pain is invisible, delayed, and buried under promises. Inflation quietly does the dirty work, eroding the value of people's savings while keeping the system alive. What we call prosperity is often just an illusion. layers upon layers of borrowed money, stacked higher with every passing year. Today, the business of debt has evolved into something far beyond simple lending. Banks no longer just collect interest, they've built entire ecosystems around managing, packaging, and profiting from debt itself. Refinancing, debt collection, and restructuring have become billion-dollar industries. Investors buy and sell government bonds like chips in a global casino, wagering on which nations will thrive or fall. Hedge funds swoop in to profit from financial distress, turning the suffering of bankrupt nations and collapsing companies into opportunity. Even credit rating agencies, the supposed referees, have become powerful gatekeepers, determining who can borrow cheaply and who must pay dearly. Debt has transformed into a vast marketplace where promises are traded like commodities and every obligation becomes a chance for profit. What's most revealing about this system is how it quietly concentrates wealth. Every payment made on a loan, every mortgage, every credit card bill sends money upward from ordinary households to the financial elite. Over time, this flow reshapes society itself. Those with assets can borrow at low rates, using debt to multiply their wealth. Those without assets pay higher interest, trapped in endless repayment cycles. It's a self-reinforcing loop, one that rewards the wealthy and punishes the poor, all under the appearance of fairness. Debt doesn't just fund economies, it defines them. It turns inequality into a permanent structure, polished and justified by the very institutions that profit from it. Today, a new chapter in the story of debt is unfolding. Central banks around the world are developing central bank digital currencies, money that exists purely in code, programmable and trackable at every level. In this new system, loans could be approved or blocked automatically, based on data profiles and algorithms. Interest rates might shift instantly with economic conditions, and penalties could be enforced the moment a payment is missed. To some, this sounds like innovation and progress, a seamless, efficient future. But history offers a warning. Whenever debt becomes more efficient for the lender, it becomes more restrictive for the borrower. The greatest financial invention of all time is being re-engineered for the digital era, shaped quietly in boardrooms and policy meetings, far removed from the people who will live under it. The story of debt is not just about economics, it's about power. Debt has never been a neutral force or a simple financial tool. It is a system deliberately built to turn human effort and ambition into predictable streams of income for those at the top. It monetizes time itself, converting years of work into interest payments that rise through the hierarchy of wealth. To see debt clearly is to understand that freedom will never come from the institutions that profit from your dependence. True financial strength lies in reducing your reliance on borrowed money, questioning the allure of easy credit, and recognizing that every loan carries a price beyond its numbers, the quiet surrender of your future potential. History may not repeat word for word, but its rhythm is unmistakable. From ancient Mesopotamian debt records etched in clay to modern suburban mortgages, from the birth of bond trading in Amsterdam to the digital derivatives of Wall Street, the narrative never truly changes. Debt always serves the same masters, enriching the lender, tightening the grip on the borrower, and reshaping societies around those who command credit. The clever part is how it's sold to us, as advancement, as innovation, as prosperity. We're taught to applaud the very mechanism that quietly transfers our future into someone else's balance sheet. If this opened your eyes or challenged what you thought you knew, make sure to subscribe. The past has already mapped the future. All you need is to know where to look.